My brother said I wasn't family anymore, until the judge asked him a question. I was gripping the edge of the polished table so hard my knuckles had gone white when my brother said it. Soren isn't family anymore. His voice came out steady, almost bored, the voice of a man who had rehearsed the line enough times that it had lost its weight for him even if it had not lost it for the room. He has no claim here. He never did. The courtroom was not large, but it felt large in the particular way that institutional spaces feel large when silence fills them, the ceiling higher, the walls further, the air thinner than it has any right to be. Judge Anita Reyes sat behind the bench with the particular stillness of someone who has heard a great many things said in front of her and has learned that the most revealing things are often said in the first 90 seconds. She was holding her pen above her notepad. She had been in the middle of writing something when my brother spoke, and the pen had stopped moving but had not been set down, which meant she intended to return to it shortly. She looked at my brother for a long moment. Then she asked him a question. It was not a complicated question. It was the kind of question a person asks when they want to find out if the person in front of them has thought carefully about what they just said. Simple, direct, and precisely positioned at the exact place where my brother's story had its most significant hole. His smirk, which had been sitting on his face since he stood up to speak, shifted. My name is Soren Caldwell. And this is how it ended. My brother Devereaux was 4 years older than me, and for most of our childhood that gap functioned as a kind of verdict. He had arrived first. He had been the proof of concept. The child who demonstrated that our parents were capable of producing someone worth celebrating, and by the time I arrived, the celebration was already allocated. Not absent entirely. My parents were not cruel people in the obvious way. They fed me, clothed me, attended school events, asked reasonable questions about my day. But the quality of attention was different, and children understand the quality of attention with an accuracy that adults often underestimate. I knew, by the time I was 8 years old, that the warmth in the room when Devereaux entered it was a different temperature than the warmth when I did. I knew that his sports results were discussed at the dinner table with the investment of people for whom the outcome had personal significance, and that my academic results were acknowledged with the pleasant neutrality of people receiving information that did not require a strong response. I knew that when relatives visited and asked about the children, Devereaux's name and recent achievements were the opening sentence and mine, if they appeared at all, arrived later and briefly. I filed these observations carefully. Not with bitterness, not yet, with the clean, patient attention of a child learning the actual rules of the environment they live in. The humiliation that changed things happened when I was 15. Devereaux was 19 and had just been accepted to study at Alderton University on a partial scholarship, partial because our parents were contributing the rest, which they had announced at dinner as if it were a national event. I had, that same week, won the state mathematics competition. First place. Out of 412 students from across the region. I had a certificate and a small trophy and my name in the regional newspaper's education section. My father heard about the state competition result, patted me on the shoulder, and said good work, Soren, in the tone he used for things he considered adequately done. Then he returned to talking about Devereaux's acceptance letter, which was spread on the table beside his dinner plate like a document of national importance. I sat with my trophy in my room that night for a long time. I looked at it for a while. Then I put it on the shelf, not facing out, facing in, toward the wall. And I made myself a promise that I kept the words of very precisely. I was not going to spend the rest of my life hoping they would notice. I was going to build something so undeniable that not noticing would require deliberate effort. And then I was going to let the truth do what truth does when it is finally allowed into a room. I treated school the way a person treats something they have decided is the most important tool they currently have access to. Not with the desperate, anxious energy of someone trying to escape something, but with the focused, deliberate attention of someone building toward a specific destination. I took the advanced mathematics and economics courses in my final 2 years of school when most of my peers were selecting the lighter options. I joined the school's debate team, not because I was naturally comfortable speaking in front of rooms full of people, I was not, at 15. but because I understood that the ability to construct and present an argument clearly would be useful for the rest of my life in ways that extended well beyond debate competitions. I led a research project that my economics teacher submitted to the regional schools competition. It placed second. My father, who heard about it from my mother, said it was good that I was keeping busy. Devereux, during a phone call home from his first year at Alderton, asked if I was still doing my little competitions. I said yes. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. I wrote it down in the notebook I had started keeping, not a diary, not a record of feelings, a factual log of specific moments, specific words, specific incidents, stored with the same methodical precision I brought to everything else. The notebook was already 14 pages long by the time I finished school. The part-time job started in my second year of university and lasted until graduation. It was administrative and research support work for a property law firm in the city, unglamorous, detail-heavy, the kind of work that rewards precision and penalizes carelessness. I was good at it almost immediately, in the particular way that a person is good at work that matches the structure of how they already think. The senior solicitor, a woman named Beatrix Holman, noticed within the first 2 months and began giving me more substantive tasks, summarizing case files, cross-referencing document records, preparing first-draft correspondence that she would review and correct. She was a careful editor and her corrections taught me more about clear, precise legal and professional writing than any course I took during my degree. By the end of my first year at the firm I was earning enough that the small allowance my parents sent was no longer functionally necessary. I let it continue arriving. I deposited it in a separate account I had opened specifically for accumulation, alongside my own earnings. My father, during a phone call in my third year of university, told me he hoped the work was not distracting me from my studies. I told him it was not. I did not tell him that the work was providing me with something more practically valuable than most of my degree modules. I had been studying my family's patterns since I was 8 years old, but it was not until I was at university that I began to understand them in their full, structural detail. The favoritism, I had always known. The specific architecture of it took longer to map. My father's favoritism toward Devereux was not simply emotional, it was financial and strategic. He had been actively shaping Devereux's trajectory since before Devereux was old enough to understand that it was being shaped, the contacts cultivated, the doors opened, the professional connections maintained and directed at Devereux at the appropriate moments in his career. Our grandfather, Edmund Caldwell, had built a modest but solid property portfolio across the city over 40 years and had died when I was 11, leaving behind a documented estate with specific provisions. I had read those provisions once, briefly, at age 17, when my mother had left the relevant folder on the kitchen counter. I had read quickly and carefully and replaced it exactly. What I read had been significant enough that I had gone away and thought about it for several months before deciding what it meant for my longer-term planning. It meant that the question of what I was owed, not emotionally, not symbolically, but legally, documentably, in writing, was one that would eventually need to be answered in a specific room in front of a specific kind of authority. I began, from that point, to build toward that room. The scholarship arrived in the spring of my second year and changed the practical shape of the following 2 years considerably. It was a merit scholarship from the Aldrin Foundation for Legal and Financial Research. Competitive, nationally advertised, awarded on the basis of academic performance, submitted research, and professional reference. I had applied on the recommendation of Beatrix Holman, who had written what she described as the most direct recommendation letter of her 20-year career. The scholarship covered tuition for my final 2 years and came with a research fellowship credit that placed my name in the Foundation's published annual review. This was the first time my name appeared in print in a professional context outside of the regional newspaper mathematics competition result from 2 years earlier. I kept a copy in the folder I was building, a physical folder, contained in a fireproof document box I kept under my desk, which held every relevant piece of documentation I had accumulated since the age of 17. The folder was organized by category rather than by date. One section for professional recognition. One section for financial records. One section for correspondence. One section, the most important section, and the one I had been building the most carefully, for legal and estate documentation. My family did not know the folder existed. That was an essential part of its function. Devereux had graduated from Alderton University 3 years before I started my degree and had moved into property development, which was the field our father had prepared him for. He was not especially talented at it. I came to understand this over time, through observation and through the specific kind of professional knowledge I was accumulating at Beatrix's firm, but he did not need to be especially talented because he had the infrastructure our father had built around him. The contacts. The introductions. The early capital that our father had released from family accounts on Devereux's behalf in a series of transfers that I had become aware of and had carefully documented. He presented himself as self-made in family conversations and at social events, which I observed with the particular interest of someone who knows what the actual record shows and has decided not to correct the narrative publicly yet. He spoke about my situation, my degree, my part-time work, my smaller life in his framing. With the easy condescension of someone who has been told their whole life that they are the version that succeeded. He called my law firm job clerical work at a Christmas dinner when I was 23, in front of 4 relatives. I smiled at him across the table. I said it was good experience. I made a note of the exact phrasing he used, the date, and the names of the people who had been present. The internship came through Beatrix's professional network in the spring of my final year of university. It was a structured placement at Veldon and Associates, a mid-sized commercial law firm that worked extensively in estate law, probate disputes, and property rights, the specific intersection of legal disciplines that was most directly relevant to the situation I had been quietly building toward for 6 years. The placement was paid and ran for 16 weeks, and it came with the possibility of conversion. Beatrix called in a professional favor to make it available and told me directly what she was doing, which was characteristic of her. She also told me that she was only doing it because she was confident I would justify the favor. I accepted immediately. My parents' reaction, when I told them, was the reaction I had come to expect. My father said he hoped it was a real firm and not too small, and my mother asked whether I was sure this was the right direction, whether I had considered something with more visibility. I said yes, I was sure. I did not explain my reasons. The internship was not a stepping stone in the career-building sense, though it functioned as one. It was a placement in the specific professional environment where I needed to build expertise and contacts for a purpose that I had been working toward for long enough that it no longer felt distant. Veldon and Associates operated in a world that I had been studying in the abstract for 6 years, and being inside it was a different kind of education. The firm handled complex estate disputes. Cases where the written provisions of a will or a trust instrument were being challenged, where family members were making competing claims, where the documented record was fighting against the verbal narrative that interested parties wanted the court to accept. I worked closely with 2 senior associates and observed how they built cases. The meticulous construction of documentary evidence, the careful sequencing of disclosure, the specific way they prepared witnesses and the specific way they anticipated the opposing argument and neutralized it before it could gain traction. I was a good observer. I had been practicing observation my entire life. Here the stakes were clear and the methodology was explicit and professional, which meant I could learn it at a pace that matched my ability to absorb and retain. I also observed the partners' relationships with their contacts, the estate administrators, the property registrars, the court clerks, the professional valuers, and I built my own versions of those relationships slowly and deliberately. I attended every court session I was permitted to attend. I took notes that went into a separate section of the folder I kept. By the end of the 16 weeks I had a working map of the process I was going to need to navigate. Beatrix Holman said many useful things to me over the 4 years I worked with her, but there was one she said toward the end of my internship at Veldon that I returned to more than the others. We were sitting in her office after the conclusion of a particularly complicated estate dispute that the firm had spent 11 months preparing and won in 2 days of hearing. Won cleanly, on the strength of the documentary record alone, without drama and without the kind of courtroom performance that less prepared legal teams often resorted to. She was tired in the way that people are tired after a thing they have worked toward for a long time is finally over. I asked her what she thought had made the difference. She said the same thing that made the difference in every case like that one. You don't need noise, she said. You need precision. Quiet victories are the most devastating kind, because the other side never sees them coming until they have already arrived. She looked at me carefully when she said it, in the way she sometimes looked at me when she was aware that what she was saying had a specific relevance beyond the general. I held the sentence and did not forget it. I had been operating on a version of the principle my entire life. Hearing it named with that precision by someone who applied it professionally every day gave it a different kind of weight. Veldon converted my internship to a full position 3 weeks before the 16 weeks were finished. The offer came from Nathaniel Veldon himself, which I was told was unusual. Conversions of that kind were normally handled by the relevant senior associate rather than by either named partner. He called me into his office on a Tuesday morning and said, in the direct, economical way of someone who does not believe in decorating a professional conversation with unnecessary words, that the firm wanted to retain me and that he was prepared to offer a junior associate position with a structured 2-year development path that would give me exposure to the full range of estate and probate work the firm handled. I accepted. I went back to my desk and completed the filing task I had been in the middle of before his call, because there was still a working day remaining and there was no reason for important news to change the quality of the work that followed it. My father, when I mentioned the position, said it was a decent start and asked whether I had looked at some of the larger firms in the city. I said I was happy where I was. I did not explain that the size of Veldon and Associates was precisely one of the reasons it suited me, that a smaller firm meant closer access to the complex, document-heavy estate cases that I needed to understand in their full detail. The Christmas dinner when I was 26 was the one where things began to fracture in ways that could not be entirely concealed. Not dramatically, my family was not a dramatic family in the expressive, confrontational sense. But beneath the table, in the quality of the exchanges, in the specific things said and not said, the structure was shifting. Devereux had, by that point, made 2 property development investments that had underperformed significantly. My father did not discuss these at the dinner table. He discussed Devereux's upcoming project, which he framed as an opportunity and which I knew from professional knowledge was positioned in a sector with considerable regulatory headwinds. My father asked me, at some point during the meal, about the kind of cases I was working on. Not dismissively, with a slightly different quality of attention than the dismissive version. I described 2 matters I had been working on, a complex multi-party estate dispute involving challenged provisions across 3 jurisdictions, and a property rights case with an evidentiary record that ran to 14,000 pages. My father was quiet for a moment. He said it sounded complicated. My aunt, who was sitting across from me, said it sounded impressive. My father looked at her briefly and then changed the subject. I noted the look. I noted the subject he changed it to. I noted how long it took him to redirect the conversation and the specific direction he chose.
In my second year at Veldon, a colleague named Reginald attempted to present work I had produced as a joint effort in which he had been the primary contributor. The work was a legal research memorandum I had spent 3 weeks preparing on the application of a specific precedent to a pattern of estate transfers that bore a structural resemblance to certain transfers I had been tracking in my personal documentation for several years. The memorandum was substantive, precise, and had been drafted entirely by me without Reginald's involvement, which he was aware of. He presented it in a partners' meeting I had not been scheduled to attend by describing it as something we had developed together, a characterization that positioned him as the lead mind on work whose value the partners were already responding to positively. I found out the same afternoon from a junior colleague who had been in the room. I was not surprised. I had observed Reginald's methods for long enough to have anticipated something like this as a possibility, which was why I had been dating and saving every draft of every significant piece of work I produced with version control documentation that would be unambiguous if examined. I compiled the record within 24 hours. I presented it to Nathaniel Veldon the following morning with a clear, factual cover note and no emotional language. Reginald was formally cautioned within the week. The referral that changed the trajectory of the next 3 years came through a contact I had made at a professional development seminar 18 months into my time at Veldon. Her name was Priscilla Okafor, and she was a senior barrister specializing in contested estate litigation, the specific high-stakes version of the work I had been building expertise in, the kind that reached courts rather than being settled in mediation. We had spoken after a seminar panel in which she had made a point about the significance of contemporaneous documentation in contested estate matters, a point that was directly relevant to the case I had been building in my personal files for 11 years, and I had asked her a follow-up question that was specific enough that she had stayed in conversation with me for 40 minutes afterward. We had maintained professional contact since. When a complex multi-party estate case came to her that required a junior associate with deep familiarity in property transfer documentation and estate provisions across multiple decades, she recommended me to the lead instructing solicitor. The engagement was significant, the most substantial matter I had worked on to that point, and it gave me direct courtroom exposure to the caliber of evidentiary argument that high-stakes estate litigation required. My parents, when I mentioned I was working on a significant new matter, asked whether it was the kind of thing that might lead to something more stable. I said I thought it might. The publication appeared in the spring edition of the Legal and Estate Practice Review, a short article on documentation strategy in multi-decade contested estate matters, drawing on patterns I had observed across the cases I had worked on at Veldon. Nathaniel had encouraged me to write it and had reviewed a draft before I submitted it, which meant it carried an implicit professional endorsement that it would not otherwise have had at my career stage. The article was 3,000 words. It was cited in a subsequent issue by a practitioner I had not met, which is how you know a piece of professional writing has reached the right audience. Priscilla Okafor sent me a brief message saying it was clean and precise and that she had forwarded it to 2 colleagues. My father saw it. I know because my mother called to tell me, in that particular voice she used for information that had affected him in a way he had not communicated directly. She said he had read it. She said he had seemed interested. She did not say what interested had looked like on his face. She did not need to. I had by that point accumulated enough data about my father's responses to unusual information to fill in the specifics myself. He called me 3 days later and asked 2 questions about the article, and I answered both, and then neither of us mentioned it again, but the call had lasted 11 minutes longer than our calls usually lasted. By the time I was 28, the financial picture I had built quietly across 6 years had a shape that would have surprised everyone in my family. I had 3 accounts in my own name at 2 separate institutions, a current account, an investment account that had been growing steadily through a conservative but consistent strategy one had developed with the help of a financial advisor I had found through Priscilla's network, and the accumulation account I had been adding to since university. I had no debt. I had a property. A 1-bedroom unit in a part of the city that the data I was reading professionally had been indicating for 2 years was significantly undervalued relative to its medium-term trajectory. I had purchased it quietly, using a conveyancer from outside my professional circle to avoid any appearance of conflict with my work, and had paid the deposit in full from my own savings without assistance. My father, during this period, continued to operate under the assumption that I was managing adequately but not comfortably, the assumption of a person who had provided modest financial support during university and had not updated their model since. I had not corrected him. I had not updated him on any of the financial details of my adult life, because those details were mine and because their accuracy was most useful when it was not yet visible to the people who had the most invested in their own version of the story. Devereux's critical error was a property development project in the Western District that he had been positioning as his most significant undertaking. He had taken on partners, raised capital from 3 private investors, and made representations about the project's regulatory status that turned out to be premature. The planning approvals he had described as secured had in fact been pending a review that resulted in significant conditions being imposed. The gap between what he had told his investors and what the documented records showed was substantial. I became aware of the details through professional channels. One of the affected investors had retained Veldon in connection with a related matter, which meant I had access to the documentation in a professional capacity that was fully appropriate and properly managed. I reviewed what I needed to review. I recused myself from the connected matter, as was correct, and passed it to a colleague. But the knowledge I now had of Devereux's professional situation was accurate, documented, and significant in ways that extended beyond the specific investor dispute. It confirmed what I had been observing for years, that the infrastructure my father had built around Devereux had substituted for the competence and discipline that infrastructure was supposed to support, and that without it, Devereux operated at a level significantly below the one he presented to the world. I noted the details. I updated the relevance section of my folder. And I waited. My parents began calling with a different quality of attention in the months following Devereux's project difficulties. My mother's calls came more frequently and stayed on practical topics, my work, my apartment, whether I was managing well, the kinds of questions that carry a layer of reassessment beneath their surface. She was recalibrating something, I could hear it in the pacing of her questions, in the specific things she asked about that she had not asked about before. My father's calls were less frequent but more pointed. He asked about estate law specifically, about the kinds of disputes that came to firms like Velden, about how long they typically ran, about what the determining factors were in contested matters. He asked these questions with the careful neutrality of a person who has a specific reason for asking but does not want to name the reason. I answered accurately and professionally, the way I would answer a client who had a general interest in the subject before they had retained anyone. I did not indicate that I knew why he was asking. I did not indicate that I had been building toward the answer to the question underneath his questions for 12 years. I answered what he asked. I was polite. I was helpful. And I listened carefully to every word he chose, and added the calls to the running record I kept of everything. The promotion to senior associate came in November, 2 months before I filed the estate claim. Nathaniel presented it the way he presented everything, directly, briefly, with the expectation of an adult professional response. The role came with 2 junior associates reporting to me, expanded client relationship responsibilities, and a formal billing rate that placed me in the upper tier of the firm's associate structure. I thanked him. I asked 2 questions about the scope of the new responsibilities. He answered both. The conversation lasted 8 minutes. I went back to my desk and opened the filing I had been working on before his call, because the work did not pause for good news and there was no reason it should. That evening I sat at my kitchen table with the folder in front of me and reviewed it for the last time before I gave it to Priscilla Okafor, who had agreed to act as my instructing barrister when the matter reached the stage of requiring one. The folder had been building for 12 years. It was orderly, complete, and documented to a standard that I knew, from professional experience, was well above what most claimants arrived with. The estate provisions were clear. The transfer records were clear. The contemporaneous documentation was extensive and unambiguous. Everything was exactly where it needed to be. I closed the folder and made myself a cup of tea and went to bed. The industry dinner was in early December, 3 weeks before the claim was filed. It was hosted by a professional association that my father attended annually as a guest of one of his business contacts, a contact who also happened to know Nathaniel Velden, which was the detail that had resulted in my also receiving an invitation that year. My father and I arrived separately and encountered each other near the entrance, which he handled with the particular controlled composure of a man who is recalibrating something in real time and does not want the recalibration to show. I was introduced to 2 of his associates during the evening, by the mutual contact, in terms that described my work at Velden and the publication in the Legal and Estate Practice Review and the Priscilla Okafor referral matter, all of which Nathaniel had mentioned publicly at the firm's annual professional profile update. My father stood beside me during both introductions and said appropriate things. His associates responded to me as they would respond to a professional peer whose work they were aware of and whose standing they considered established. I watched my father experience this. I did not watch him obviously. I am practiced enough at not watching obviously that the watching is invisible. But I saw what was on his face when the second associate said, "I have heard good things about your work, Soren," and it was not what had ever been on his face when he looked at me before. The message from Cosimo Ferrante arrived the week after the industry dinner. Cosimo and I had been at university together, he had been in the year above me, studying law, and we had been in a competitive academic relationship for 2 years in which we had both pushed each other's work to a higher standard than either of us would have reached without the competition. We had not maintained close contact after he graduated, but we had kept peripheral professional awareness of each other's trajectories. He had gone into practice at a larger firm in the city, had developed a strong reputation in commercial litigation, and had recently been instrumental in a significant ruling that had received coverage in several legal publications. His message was brief and direct. He had been aware of the estate claim I had filed. The filing was a matter of public record at that point, and he had a professional connection he thought might be useful to me in the proceedings. His contact was a property valuation expert whose documented assessments had been accepted by the courts in 6 contested estate matters over the previous 4 years. He offered to make the introduction. I accepted within the hour. The expert's assessment, when completed, added a layer of independent professional authority to the evidentiary record that made what was already a strong case substantially stronger. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in late February, in a civil courtroom on the 4th floor of the city's main justice building. I had been in this building many times professionally. I had sat at the instructing solicitor's table and watched barristers present cases I had helped build. I had observed judges listen to arguments and asked the precise, targeted questions that separated the well-prepared cases from the less well-prepared ones. Sitting at the claimant's table on my own behalf, with Priscilla at the bar table in front of me, was a different experience, not more frightening, exactly, but more personal in a way that required a different kind of management. Judge Anita Reyes had presided over 2 contested estate matters that Veldon had been involved in. I knew her reputation for precision. Devereux sat at the respondent's table with his legal representative, a solicitor from a larger firm who I recognized professionally and whose preparation I had assessed as adequate but not exceptional. Devereux's demeanor was the demeanor he brought to situations where he believed he was going to win, a studied ease, a controlled confidence that read as authority to people who did not know what real authority looked like up close. He made his statement about my not being family and having no claim with that ease, that confidence, that smirk that had been a fixture of his face since we were children, and he had understood that the room defaulted to him. Then Judge Reyes asked her question. The question Judge Reyes asked Devereux was this: could he identify, by document reference, the specific provision in the estate instrument that supported his claim that I had no entitlement? It was not a hostile question. It was the kind of question a judge asks when they have reviewed the submissions in advance and have identified the place where one party's argument has a structural problem, and want to give that party the opportunity to address it before the hearing proceeds. It was, in every technical sense, fair. Devereux looked at his solicitor. His solicitor looked at the submission bundle. There was a pause of approximately 12 seconds, which in a courtroom is a long pause. Long enough that the quality of the silence changes, that the people in the room begin to understand that the pause is not preparation but absence. The provision Devereux had built his position on, the provision his solicitor had cited in the submission, was a section of the estate instrument that applied specifically to transfers made after a defined date. The transfers at the center of my claim predated that section by 11 years. This was the hole in Devereux's story. This was the hole I had identified 12 years ago when I read the folder on my mother's kitchen counter and decided what I was going to spend the next decade building toward. Priscilla presented my documentary record over the following 4 hours. Judge Reyes ruled in my favor 3 weeks later. The decision was documented, filed, and final. I did not celebrate the ruling in any visible way. I read the judgment in my office on a Thursday afternoon, read it twice, and then set it on the desk beside the folder that had been 12 years in the building, that had started with a quick read of a document on a kitchen counter when I was 17 and had grown, one dated note and one filed document and one professional contact at a time, into the thing that had just been sufficient. I called Priscilla and thanked her. I called Beatrix Holman, who had started everything by taking me seriously when I was a part-time university student and a better-than-expected legal researcher. I sent Cosimo Ferrante a professional acknowledgement. I did not call my father. I did not call Devereux. There was nothing that needed to be said to either of them that was not already in the public record of the judgment. My brother had said I was not family. He had said it in a courtroom, in front of a judge, with the confidence of a man who had never seriously considered the possibility that the thing he was saying might not be true. The judge had asked him one question and the confidence had broken. I had spent 12 years building the answer to that question. Some things take exactly as long as they take. And some doors, when they finally open, had been unlocked for longer than anyone on the outside knew.